And in this area, ironically, Gordon's report is less radical than Gordon's government when he was in power. And I think we should try and get public services back into the discussion about devolution. And lastly, the thorny problem of geography, what level we devolve powers to. It's self-evident that English local government is messy. In part, that's because England's social, political, and economic geography is messy. One size doesn't fit all anywhere within England. But there's also an issue for the voters, because so there's a practical problem as well for Labour, that if we came in saying, well, let's start off with the needs of the government, we would not do anything else for the next 5 years. We'd totally bog down in the organisation. So starting from where we are, as the report suggests, is a good idea. But there's also this issue that voters identify with certain places that they think they live. These often don't map onto the functional market economic areas that technocrats like, and they very rarely map onto the regions that actual bureaucrats like to draw to divide up England. Yet there are some issues that are best dealt with at a quite local authority level. There are other issues like strategic transport that you need to deal with at a regional level. So the big challenge of a lot of this is how you work out what lies at which level. Basically, the approach that the report has taken has been to say, well, we want to impose regions, but we will require people to come up with regional structures that get approved by Whitehall. I mean, most of the major powers around skills, spatial planning, transport, energy would lie at the regional level. I would just float the idea that there's an alternative approach where you actually devolve those powers to larger local authorities and defined authorities and enable them to work together to create regional structures where they make sense. That's what's happened in the north of England with Transport North. Without it being imposed from outside, I think we would get further faster, devolve, and then enable local authorities to work together. So in summary, and I hope that wasn't too long, I hope in the next couple of years we can have more debate about how we can get clear national government. I realise I haven't dealt with the issue of Commons legislation, English Parliament. Those issues are important debates, but they're not what Brown is about. There's a lot of Brown we need to deal with. Secondly, we need to say which powers go to local areas by right. Thirdly, how do we get fair devolved funding? And fourthly, what's the best way to get the right powers devolved to the right area? John, I'll leave it at that.
So thanks, John, and thanks for the invite. So first things first, I thought the report, I thought it was good. I think there's some good things about it. And I think I want to there's two things that I thought were good about it. First of all is that both Cllr and Gordon, by adopting this report, by writing the report, embarking to basically told that kind of sneering element of the media and the political establishment think that this isn't a doorstep issue. It's how it's an issue. How people are governed, who governs them, how they're governed is an important issue. It was an important issue in Brexit. It was an important issue in the Scottish referendum, something that people care about. So that's the first thing, and I'm glad they've done that. I think secondly, it's an acknowledgement that a growing number of people in this country no longer trust the political class of this country to rule them. That trust has been abused. Wealth has been offshored. Our economic commons have been plundered. Many of the political class have got into bed with oligarchs and Russians. They've delivered a disaster on Brexit. We've seen the largest fraud in living standards in living memory. So people see it on our social media. You're all the same. I don't trust you. We've heard it all before. And we also know that every successful Conservative party in the Western world, in the modern era, has won by tapping into that feeder. And so I guess any progressive party that's serious about government has to address it as well. And that's what this report attempts to do. So I applaud that. And I think that's the good bit. But there are a series of issues which I kind of feel this report hasn't lived up to. And it's quite broad. And I know we're trying to focus on England, so I'll try and keep it. So look, yes, abolishing the House of Lords is great. But let's be honest, it's a democratic thing. It's not radical. What's radical in a reactionary is the fact that the House of Lords still exists, that it's made up of cronies, of people who have millions to pay into political party, or they are the distant relatives of some former crony of the king or clerics of our state religion. Frankly, it needs to go. And I think we can all acknowledge that, and a report does that. That's not radical, but it's the first step. But what's it replaced with? Well, I personally that it shouldn't be an English parliament per se, it's been put down here, but rather a parliament of the nations and regions. So what I would like to see in effect is, I think that what Gordon has done, he's basically set up a situation by bringing in a second chamber, which will be arguably elected under first past the post. I know we're not going to talk too much about PR today, but I think the fact that that is missing from this report is a fundamental error. I know he's mentioned it slightly about electing devolved mayors, and that's the right thing to do, reversing that. How can we talk about radical constitutional reform when we're not going to even engage in the issue of the very voting system that gives us the governance that we have? But what he's done by creating this new parliament is what he's done is he set up a situation where not having a written constitution, something else that isn't, we have an unwritten constitution, which at the moment we know creates tension in this country. It's a constant source of tension. And what you've done, you've taken that and you've institutionalized it into a second chamber. And by electing that second chamber, presumably under first past the post, you're also building in an integral base and overwhelming ability for the Conservative Party to benefit from first past the post. Overwhelming. We know they've won 3 times as many elections as the Labour Party in the last century. You're handing them the power undo all of the changes that you make constitution by law. So not having a written constitution, I think, is a mistake. I think bedding in that tension by not having that constitution in a chamber elected by first past the post is deeply problematic. I also think that it also is, I think as well, by having a parliament that sets up in this way, we're creating further problems down the line. Because one of the things I think you can see is if I was to put a proposal to the British, and I think one of the things that we need to do is we need to understand that Scotland is, to be able to define England, we're also going to have to deal with the Scottish. I don't think this report does, because ultimately, in this country, forced marriage is illegal, rightly so. And you cannot have a policy, a union of countries, where one of those countries or more feel that they are forced into that. And we can argue about whether the Scottish people want to stay or go, and there should be a second referendum. But the reality is this has to be based on consent. And I don't feel at the moment this commission tackles that sufficiently. So what would I like to see? I'd like to see, well, first of all, I'd like to see whatever proposals come out put to the British people. And I know that when Cllr spoke, he said there will be consultation. But I think that consultation has to go to the British people. How can you talk about rebuilding our democracy without giving the British people a real say over what that democracy looks like? I think that's a key point. And I'd like to know what that consultation looks like, who we're going to be consulting. This can't be a fix from the top down to the British people. So abolish the laws. I think we should replace it with strong regional parliaments elected by people. And turn the Commons into a parliament of the nations and regions of England with a system of pooled sovereignty. And that means stripping sovereignty from the Crown, handing it to the people, and convening conventions of we the people, draw up how we want to use it and share it. But I will reiterate, I think this is a good first step, but it doesn't go far enough. And I think as well, in terms of how we're going to map out what it looks like at a granular level, at a regional level, at a local level, that hasn't been done. I want to just finish on one stat, which I think is quite revealing. The average population per local government entity in Germany is 7,000. That's where you begin to get real power at that granular level, 7,000 people. France is 1,800. In the UK, it's 195,000. So I think we need to disperse power a lot more than this. And I also think we need to consult a lot more. And then I think we'll begin to get into a situation where we start to really look at the future of the policy of this country. And I hope it would stay together under those circumstances.
Thank you. I think I'll start. So I wanted to take a slightly different. First of all, sorry, I could also thank John and this team for today, for everybody for coming and engaging. It's really important. And whatever funding becomes the centre of our local communities and our youth. I wanted to focus on some very specific points about the potential within the Brown report and go forward for economic growth and regeneration linked to a new relation between local and national government. And I wanted to discuss and talk about the example of what's happened in Reading in the last years. We're very proud of our town. We have our own density, and we've managed to achieve something which is relatively unusual in terms of our relationship with the central government, getting cross-track to come and be the western terminus in Berkshire, in our hotspot rather than the location. And I wanted to really flag up the potential for Brown reports in terms of economic growth using this local example. Just to give you some context, our area, we're the second biggest urban area in the southeast of England. We have a university, thriving IT industry. We're outside London. We're very distinct from London. We're 35 miles, obviously, we're parts of the southeast of England. And we, the town and the area has changed dramatically in my lifetime. Also for a manufacturing town, it's now very much a town which has a legacy wider through excellent from knowledge and so to us, having that connectivity with best transport is really important. And we're very proud of the role that our local authority, our borough council, played with Labour governments and securing the western things in our town. Now, that issue is hugely important. That change is hugely important for us. And you can see the benefits of rapid public transport across all of the one route in Essex, in London itself, and but the challenge I think for us is to learn from that example and see how practical, closer working, clearer set of priorities for local government power can actually help to more local authorities. So first of all, a little bit about the history of Australia coming to power, and then also, as I understand it, the discussion took place during the 2000s, and therefore the need for learning from that and for a closer and better working relationship, particularly in town government. And so the history of Australia is a long-standing project going back many, many years. Originally, the western terminus was usually made. That was a Whitehall-led view of where the line should finish. Didn't take into account local made sense. And Reading Borough Council in the 2000s, before then, started to bring together a group of other local councils within their wider region. And they've managed every single local community of Berkshire, Reading being the western term of. And that sort of local discussion, ability to lobby Whitehall's group, the power of local authorities working together is really important, relatively rare. And so I really would like to make the point that, and I do hope the Brown reports and further evolution of policy from it will offer local councils and communities much ability to master their arguments in the same way. In terms of the difference between the original White and the one that happened a number of years to brief Reading's concern. That has led to real realignment of lots of employment towards obtaining that. I think another points on the western corridor, that's not London, because you now have a situation where there's north south in southern Midlands, east west, better connections to the links to Reading. So that wouldn't have been without the lobbying of their colleagues from local governments in the region. So But unfortunately, that sort of approach is relatively rare. And what I hope we do is to really reflect on and learn from these examples, use the ideas of them around trying to raise a much voice for English sub-regions, local communities, relatively into London and Southern England, or region within further away. Have a much stronger voice for our community, and that clearer and a more powerful voice in Westminster would argue what we've done is on local priority. And as a result, to attract jobs and economic growth to transit systems. One simple way actually of illustrating this is if you ever are on the train line going out of London, just look at where there are on stations, and you'll notice a series of breaks in our town centre. We now have buildings that are up to 14 7 stories long, and on this teenager is one existed 2 story, 3 story. And that indicates land value, wealth, quite clearly see that last. And I would hope in other regions, whether it's Yorkshire and many other parts of England, that are seeing transport argued for by local government with a voice listened to by through greater understanding, will allow us to make the same impact and have the same lens of that greater result. I appreciate time's limited. I wanted to ask you questions or to sort of pitch something to the my colleagues. I'm interested in those possibilities of the also other. Right, I would just like to pitch some thoughts to you. Basically, I know shared at DWP and one other area that I was privileged to briefly elected is greater employment. And I would suggest you to have a look at the work that my boss John Ashworth has been doing this area and others in employment. I do think that there's a number of other factors that come together. We have a bigger voice in transport, a bigger voice in employment, and then wider regeneration. Lots of those things I think come together and make are a very attractive offer for counties. I'd be interested to know what other colleagues think about that. I'm going to stick to very conceptual terms. I'm trying to focus on some very specific things. I believe has a wider impact. There are many other things down to this trying to move from the model that's now changed to maybe more of a knowledge-led one. So it's something which many well, appears to be just to finish, I hope that I realise that very specific example using transport or indeed other related areas. But I do think there are so many different dimensions of this, and in general terms, ground people represent the community to make a huge range of things. What we now need to go and work through the detail and see how it can help us in our own areas in many different. I think we've figure something looking to invite them.
That's really good. So I think the first thing to say is that on the other speakers, I really welcome this report because I think normally when you get to the fag end of the government, you start to think about whether you could have done more to connect with people. And I think the fact that we're addressing this at this point in the electoral cycle is good. Let's hope that we carry on examining this, because I think some of the findings in the report are really, really quite worrying and should be a real warning to us about what we face in terms of trying to reconnect with the public. So, for example, the first finding that 50% of the public believe that nothing will change no matter who you vote for. I think that is an absolutely frightening statistic, and the idea that half the people out there don't believe who you vote for is a matter of consequence to their own lives is actually a real threat to democracy itself. So we absolutely have to heed that message. 60% of people apparently believe that Britain has a ruling elite who will always be in charge. Then again, that is an incredibly worrying statistic, because it sends the message out that there is whoever's in charge. There's a group of people who will continue to make the decisions, and I think that we don't address those concerns now. I think populism, as Clive has already mentioned, will make a comeback, and it will make it very difficult for us to not only gain power but stay in power. So we have to absolutely tackle this head on as a priority. And I think that there's some really good stuff in here about cleaning up politics, particularly the way MPs operate. I think that's important for trust and accountability, because as has already been mentioned, there's a perception that we're all in it for ourselves and we can't be trusted. Anything we can do to clean up politics has got to be a good thing. But there's also, I think, as is reflected in those figures, sense that, politics is London and everywhere else doesn't matter. And, I probably said that the last time I was here, but I believe that is still the case. If you look at the senior echelons of most political parties, it's a very, very similar sounding and looking group of people, and we absolutely have to make sure that we truly reflect the whole nation. And of course, it doesn't help that we are the most centralised country in Europe, and we have 75% of spending dictated nationally, 25% dictated locally. But actually, if you look at that 25% dictated locally, you can take away all the things that people have to do by law. There is very, very little left to enable people to have their own distinctive vision for their areas. And actually, that's probably one of the main reasons why people have a sense of disconnection. And it is a very dangerous time for us as a country, because it's very tough economically, as we know. People will begin to realise that Brexit isn't going to deliver the great new world that they were promised and they believe they were voting for. And as we can see from the wave of industrial action we've got, and through people's own experiences, every single part of the public sector is absolutely on its knees. And of course, that is as a result of a decade of austerity. So people will look at the situation and say, well, it isn't working. Why should we have faith in anyone to deliver for us? And I think that's particularly acute at a council level, because they have had, as John's already mentioned, huge level of cuts to their spending over the last decade. And of course, what's the first thing you notice when you open your door in the morning? The bins have been collected, whether the roads have been gritted, whether the grass verges have been cut. And if those things aren't happening the way they used to, people really have a sense that actually none of this works, and therefore there isn't much point in getting involved. So we absolutely have to give people a much greater sense of control of their destiny, and I think this report recognises that is necessary. And I think it is couched in quite broad terms deliberately, probably not just because people couldn't agree on what the answer is, but because actually this is part of an ongoing conversation that we've got to have. But it has to be that conversation. It has to start now, and it has to be delivered within the first term of the Labour government, because I fear it could end up being one of those things that gets into the too difficult box. We saw what happened with the House of Lords under the last Labour government. There was no real consensus about what reform should look like. Therefore, reform was, in the end, I'm afraid, fairly modest. So this is going to take political will. It's going to take political courage, and I think there has been a great deal of courage taken to actually address this in the first place. But that's the easy bit. Deciding that there's a problem, agreeing on a solution, and actually delivering it are much harder. So, what is England's place in the Union of Nations and Regions is a very, very good question. Well, the first thing to say is England should have a place, but it's got to be England. It's not just London. And at the moment, I'm afraid there is a perception out there that Whitehall dominates the discussions far too often. I think there is a strong case for those local leaders that we've all got in councils to be having a seat at the table. We've seen some degree the success elected mayors have had. Not every area will be suitable for an elected mayor, but actually there is, I think, the beginnings of a relationship there between those advocates for their local areas and people they represent that we haven't seen for a long time. You look back, I first got interested in politics in the 1980s. I think most people would probably name one or two council leaders in the 1980s. Not always a good thing, but most people could probably say who at least one or two council leaders were. I don't think that is the case anymore, and I think that reflects actually the reduction in powers, the reduction in discretion, and the reduction in financing that council face. I think that has got to be reversed. Likewise, in anyone there who the chair of their LEP is, suspect not. And again, those bodies have got quite important powers, but there is a huge disconnect between their delivery and their accountability. I think that those two bodies have got to be put together, and it is going to be on a sub-regional basis. I think that's probably the most sensible footprint to do it on. And I do absolutely agree that it has to be those areas themselves deciding what is best for them. So my area, Cheshire, is a good example of somewhere where actually it will make sense for us to work with one area on one thing and another area on another. We are very close to Merseyside on one side, very close to North Wales on another. And heaven forbid we would actually cross a national boundary to get things done. But that's what we should be doing, because that is our area of economic and social interest. And that is why a top-down approach as to what will work in each area can't be applied. So I think that this idea that we give sub-regions a broad power and then leave it up to them to decide how they deliver it is got to be the way ahead. I think in terms of this proposal on legislation, I think that's really, really interesting. I think it has to be a constitutional right. I don't think that there's any point in doing it if it's still about the government deciding what you can and can't do. We've got too much at the moment of people going in with begging bowls to get the latest levelling up bid or the town sun bid. And it's all done on Westminster's terms. If we're going to be serious about this, if we're actually generally going to give people power back, Westminster's got to let go and say, these are your powers. You decide what you have to do with them. And that's a big thing. And you know, I'm sure lots of people in opposition have come in with good intentions, and when they get behind the desk, they feel a little bit less urgent need to do those things. But this is about our democracy's future. This is about actually saving democracy, because if we can't get that connection back, we are going to be in a difficult place. So we've got to have the courage to take that step, and then actually let those local areas deal with the consequences that are bad. Local taxation, I think it's an incredibly thorny issue, because of course not every area will have the same capacity to raise funds. And there's a dichotomy there, isn't there, that actually we're still going to be reliant on central government funding to deliver a lot of these things, if we're going to do it in a fair way. But again, that involves Whitehall letting go. I think taking back control has to mean at the other end of it, letting go. And I think that's what we're going to actually see Westminster and Whitehall do. So I know it's probably gone over my time, so I will finish there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's great.
No, so my name is Councillor Rasool, and I'm from the London Borough of Waltham Forest, which is North East London. We are the borough that produced David Beckham, Harry Kane, William Morris, Alfred Hitchcock. So we have given a lot to England, and it's partially to Yorkshire as well. And I'm kind of speaking from, we were supposed to have Michelle with us. However, she's not well, so I'm covering in her place. And I want to just go through kind of looking at things at council level, but also kind of giving a London perspective as well, because I think sometimes there's a sort of London versus the rest of England kind of thing that comes up that we struggle to at council level here. So just to give you some background, my ward is probably one of the smallest wards in the borough, but my tiny ward is 14,000 residents in a very small scale. And like other local authorities across England, in London as well, we face massive but for us, I think sometimes the pressure hits harder because we have 9 million people and very big population. And for me, the key thing that I want to see with any sort of idea of, let's say, giving more power and devolution is actual, in my view, getting rid of some of the red tape that prevents councils from being able to achieve more for the area. So every council, every area has its specific issues, its specific shortages. For example, in my council, we're very focused on house building. We have housing issues. Like most London boroughs, we have overcrowded housing. We have problems with bad landlord. So we've been able to bring in rent, like sort of like landlord licensing, a few small changes like that. But as kind of councillors, we'd love to do more in our local authorities so that we can actually meet the needs of people in that area. So often I found as well that we deal with lots of residents who kind of come to us and complain about this thing, this policy. And then we have to say to them, well, this policy isn't really in our control. So as councils, we often feel like there's a lot of red tape. We're held back from doing and kind of meeting the specific needs of our area. And I think for me, with any report, any proposal, it needs to be very specific. Just as John said earlier, there needs to be clear legal rights of what we can do. I know that Sadiq Khan, for example, has been speaking about the idea of rent controls in London. And as someone, I'm quite aware statistic in local government. Only 15% of councillors are under 45. I'm a 27-year-old councillor, and I'm part of the generation that is locked out for a housing market. And I'm just one of like many thousands in my borough, people who are raised in London, grew up in London, but can't afford to stay in London anymore. I'm lucky to have my family there, but a lot of people are not. So there needs to be sort of more powers given fiscally. Definitely need to give more powers on house building. And that's where I think that if we are going to be looking at sort of devolution and stuff, we also need to look at how we look at planning as well, and many other smaller, more specific mechanisms. So that's sort of the key thing that I would want to bring up. But also, I think if we look at a wider context nationally, if we look at how council systems work across the country, they're very confusing. So we have, like London, you have London Borough System, and we have our London Assembly, but outside London, we have some councils that are unitary, some that are two-tier, three-tier, and the multi-tier systems are also a big problem. So if we are going to bring about changes, are we also reforming the tier systems that we have so it's easier to govern? Because often when I speak to my colleagues outside London, especially whenever I go to conference and I meet councils everywhere, and they say, well, I'm on the district council, so I can do this, and I'm on the county council, I can do this. Most of the time, because so I can do this, but I can't do that, and it's just there's also that thing we need to very specifically look at as well. I think a lot of the speakers before were speaking about the idea of like regional networks and hubs and sort of systems like that. But I do think at the end of the day, until we recognise England-specific issues, we have England-specific departments and an England-specific institution, we're not going to be able to help our local councils effectively govern. But we also need to trust them and give them power. And like earlier, someone said that the first one we care about is the bins, and this some of our biggest cases was bins. Bins, pavements, potholes, that sort of stuff. So definitely, from a political perspective, from a campaign perspective, a Labour government that wants to stay in power understands that Labour councils need to be able to perform better locally to keep voters to win. Because that's always the first stage of democracy. That's the first contact people have with elected politicians as well. Yeah, I'm just conscious of time. So that's what I'd really want to take away. I didn't want to prepare something to put a few notes down, but that was just some of the issues I wanted to raise, was basically the fact that councils are struggling with the decades of cost of living, and COVID as well has meant that many councils have gone into reserve. And we have seen a few positive changes in some areas. For example, in my council, Northern Forest, we've innovated because we know that we're struggling with getting funding for council housing. The way we innovate is we set up our own developing arm. So we actually have a in-house council developer that now builds socially affordable homes. So we've had to innovate by finding loopholes in that system. So but one thing I'd say is that councils shouldn't have to do that. We should have the legal powers to do and the financial powers to do more things themselves. Yeah, thank you.
So I'm a councillor in Worthing, first time in May. And one of the biggest things that we picked up on the doorstep from people was how they felt their certainly in my area, the local community have been neglected, been been left behind. And a lot of the talk about add-on power to regional level, I think, some of the biggest stuff, yes. But then how do you make that power accountable to people in local areas? Because I think even the government are very keen on county devolution deal. And even within my county of West Sussex, decisions that are made, at county level, are made in Chichester, which is the county hub. It's the county now, county and actually aren't accountable to local people in all the local authorities. So I suppose the question is, do you still, if you have devolved powers to a regional level, is that the end of it? All the made a regional level, or do you then devolve things further down to individual councils? Because even at that level, you can devolve things further, and councils can allow local people to make decisions about their specific community, not about the council. I think that's the big question. You've got to be very careful about how you devolve it, and making sure that decision making is accountable to the very micro local level, not just at region. Thank you.
Cool. So yeah, just on that one about balancing national and local, if anyone would like to answer any of those questions, how do you think Labour might be able to get that kind of balance right between the two? John, would you mind? Yes.
Let me have a go. I think the question is a really, really good one, because the answer is that there are some things that need to be at a lot wider level than others. So if you're talking about strategic transport, then when I live in Winchester, so it's not that far along the coast from Worthing, you actually need to deal with the whole regional traffic, connecting to London, the connection from Bournemouth to Bristol. The classic way we've done it in the past is we divided England into regions, irrespective of what actually happened in the real world. So we have a southeast regional transport policy that stops a few miles short of Bournemouth. Somebody in Whitehall thinks that Bournemouth is in the West Country, even though nobody in Bournemouth, Christchurch and Paul think they're in the West Country. So you have to be flexible. Things like housing that we're talking about don't make sense at the regional level, because they're about real communities and places that people want to live in. I think the real choice and the real danger and the opportunity of Brown, if you like, is you can either sit in Whitehall and say, well, we think you should have this power at this level, this power at this level, this power at this level, which I think will result in Whitehall control. I think the natural instinct of centralisation will be, actually, we don't want to let too much go too far. Second approach is actually to devolve to a relatively local level and then let councils come together. Councils, I don't think, are quite as stupid as most people in Whitehall think they are. And I think councils actually recognise, as a Matt's classic example, Reading could actually understand it needed to work in coalition with other people to deliver the rail infrastructure. That wasn't what Whitehall had thought about. So I think the real choice is, if you like, devolve almost to the extent of devolving more locally, absolutely makes sense, but rely on people locally to work out. So I reckon you and Worthing would very quickly work out where you had to work with the county, because there's stuff in Worthing you can't deal with in Worthing, but there's stuff you can. So my bias would be towards devolving further. And all right, be honest, some places will mess it up, but Whitehall messes it up. That's the thing to learn, that the idea, and I was a minister, and you sit behind Justin, actually, you get into the ministerial office, and you think, I'm going to pull this lever, and I can change stuff from Cumbria to Cornwall, and it takes you about 5 years to realise your lever wasn't attached to anything, because you can't actually do that. So, yes, if you devolve quite a long way, some people will make a mess of it, but actually the illusion that Whitehall stops people making a mess of it is one of the things that got us into this terrible centralisation we've got at the moment. So yeah. So
it isn't it's all part of it. So I think one of the things that you very thoughtful points, obviously, and huge experience in governments as well. Just building on one particular aspect of that, I think that the key takeaway for me personally is that England is very uneven. And so if the government wants to have a sort of one-size-fits-all approach, possibly based around counties, that doesn't really reflect local economy, local identity, local population. And probably the southeast of England, as you said with the example of Bournemouth, really good. Obviously, I'm biased being from that part of the country, but it's a large and diverse region, which arguably is better to see as a series of sub-regions. So our part of the southeast, in central southern England, in the Thames Valley in particular, it takes 2 hours to get to Kent, to Canterbury. You could be in Manchester in the same amount of time. Our economy is very much linked to in the area I am, to West London, Heathrow, the M4 motorway, advanced manufacturing, IT, and there's quite a big science economy in Oxfordshire linked to the university as well. That's really different to, again, if you take the example of Kent or the South Coast, the local economy, more maritime, linked to a range of other industries, really quite different to ours. And yet we're seen as being part of one region. And by the way, the population of southeast of England is about 7 million people. So it's the size of a small European country, about the same size as Austria. So I do think we need to have a more kind of thought and flexibility and understanding of both of the overlay of both the kind of economic and geographical realities and identity. And again, on the identity point, certainly there are some individual counties within England with very, very strong ethnic identities. If you take example like Cornwall or some other counties in perhaps the north or indeed the east of England, there are other areas where counties interact with one another. So in our part of England, parts of Reading Borough used to be in Oxfordshire, and effectively Oxford and Reading they swapped bits of land on either side of the River Thames. Because the Thames was a historic boundary, it doesn't make any sense of boundary anymore. And the two counties, the travel to work patterns and people's living arrangements are so intertwined. So that there are other areas where counties as units don't work quite as clearly. So I would just kind of caution some variation across England and understanding of these differences in different parts of England.
I'll just pick up on the question. Okay. See,
They can't.
they can't. Right. Sorry. So that. So what John said. So what John said then about pushing decisions out to local people makes complete sense in two ways. First of all, it makes sense in the sense that we are Democrats first and foremost. I'd like to think in this party, and we should trust people, and actually giving people power, pushing that ability for people to make those decisions to them is the right thing to do. Trust people. It's what we should be doing in the kind of democracy that we could have. But there's also another side to it, which is it actually works. Now, if you look at the military, they have something called the 7-question analysis and something called mission command. And where this comes from is in the first place, really bizarre. In the First World War, we were constantly getting our butts kicked by the Germans in trench warfare. And the reason was the Germans had something called mission command, which is basically you had your kind of strategic and tactical doctrine that everyone had to follow. But then once the fog of war kind of came down, the soldiers on the ground knew what their objectives were, and they were able to respond according to the conditions on the ground. But a hyper-localized condition, there might not be a barrage of artillery there, where in the plan you had to go through that bit, so they would go around it. The British, anytime that you wanted to make a change, you had to go back up to command. And during the battle, that was very difficult. So artillery's there. That's what the orders had said. You'd walk through the artillery, you'd get wiped out. And that's pretty much what happened. It gave that responsiveness. So there is a good reason for wanting to push power out to local people. Because we've already said, they know better. They know locally what works. They know what people think. They also understand the dynamics, the local dynamics, the infrastructure, the traditions, the history of the area. They'll make better decisions by and large. So I think part of it is trust, but part of it is that it also works better as well. But I also think as well, when we're talking about the concept of England, what is England? England's different things to different people. I would say that, the reason I don't think we should have an English parliament per se, but an parliament of the nations and regions, and then strong local, regional, devolved government or assemblies, if you want. It's because to be English in Cornwall, it's a very different proposition from being English in Essex, which is a very different proposition from being English in Yorkshire, which is a very different proposition from being English on the borders and Northumberland. So actually, England is a complex, because of its history, because the Vikings came in one end, the Normans came in the other, the Saxons came in the east. It's a very complex, diverse country. And we can't just So I think what we've tried to do is this kind of one size fits all. This is England, and I think we should be imaginative. I think we should give people the fact that understand the fact that some people have a very different view of how they want to go about things, what their identity is, and we can mesh that into a united whole. And the very last thing I would say is, in terms of Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland, we have to kind of see, at the moment we have four countries in one union, but with one country, London in England, having all the power. And I think that has to change, and that power has to be pushed out, evolved out, and that sovereignty needs to be shared between the four nations and the regions. And I think that will be a lot better in terms of making people feel that they are empowered.
Great, thank you very much, Clive. We're just going to have a look at see any of our questions on chat. Okay. Oh, okay. Quite a lot of essays. I remember that one. Cool. John, there's one directed towards you. Specifically about the general well-being in the Local Government Act 2000 have been used. Has anyone done any research? Is there any such thing as a champion role within local authorities or anywhere else for it?
Very, very, very briefly. To Linda Gilroy, I don't know of research into the general power of well-being. As you put in your question, I think the real problem is that, though in theory the power of well-being freed up local authorities to do new and innovative things, certainly since 2010, the dramatic cut in funding for local authorities means the ability to do that has been more constrained. So some of the innovation, for example, that Uzma was talking about, entrepreneurial activities like local authorities, there have definitely been examples of that, but actually without the resources that go with it, I think the scope has been more limited than probably we all hoped in the Local Government Act in 2000. And I think it's worth noting, we put a fortune into regional development agencies, which were swept away within 3 months. And you can create institutions, but if they aren't rooted in local identity, they're very easy to get away with. And I do wonder, have we gone further in devolution to a more local level in the way that we were talking about? Maybe people would have used that money in more innovative ways, and it wouldn't be much more difficult for the incoming government just to sweep it all away.
Thank you very much, John. Yeah, there's a Brexit question here. Everyone's favorite. Great. Do you think the suggestion in the Brown report would address this when we refer to Brexit can be viewed as driven by English identifiers who felt they were disenfranchised and lacked any political efficacy, especially as they lack sovereignty because of the EU regulation? Do you think the suggestions in the Brown report would address this, and which in particular would be most relevant? So yeah, that sounds quite particularly relevant to the kind of take back control bill that Keir's been talking about. Suppose. Yeah, Kristen.
Well, as I'm the bench lead on the EU revocation bill, which is coming back into Parliament tomorrow, we have been spending an awful lot of time looking at this, and I think there is a view on the Conservative side that the whole point of Brexit was that these terrible rules that have been foisted on us should have had proper parliamentary scrutiny in the first place. But actually, if you look at the detail of what these laws are, I'm hard pushed to find many people who think that they're a bad idea. Obviously, we've got lots of employment rights, paid holidays, TP, maternity rights, environmental protections, consumer rights, all things that actually part of our everyday lives now. The social chapter was clearly a 1997 Labour manifesto commitment, absolutely crystal clear. That was something we were going to introduce. It is not right to say that we didn't have a democratic route for that to come part of our laws. So I think the whole Brexit debate, the whole issue of these regulations has been used as a proxy for a frustration with the system more generally. I don't think it's the specific way these laws have been introduced that has been a problem, because actually when you get into the detail, there aren't that many people who find these laws particularly offensive. And when you've got a government that are using more and more of their power to make ministerial decisions without parliamentary scrutiny, we're not actually going to find ourselves in a place which is any more democratic or accountable. I think the frustrations people have with this country and why they voted to leave the European Union are, by and large, within the gift of this country to resolve. And that is about some of the things that are addressed in this report: a lack of agency over decisions that affect everyday lives, a lack of control, feeling of powerlessness, feeling the insecurity that pervades every community. And I think if we can actually use the feeling of that's been identified in the report and actually genuinely return power and resources back to people, then I think the whole frustration many people feel will actually dissipate. And that, as I said earlier, I think that's going to take a lot of courage and a lot of hard work, and it is easier said than done. But that is the essential challenge our government, if we get into power, will face.
Right. Just because we mindful of the time. Yes. So finally, but one more question here. No, we don't actually. Sorry, Clive, did you want to come in?
Very quickly, I just think that we're gonna find ourselves back here. What the Brown report does, I think it's asked a question: how can we keep the show on the road? And that's the current show on the road, in giving away, I think, as little as possible. And so this isn't a radical document. And so there are three things I think it needs to address and doesn't. One, it needs to articulate. The party needs to articulate how it's going to consult. If you're going to talk about democracy, you don't do democracy to people. These are fundamental democratic changes. Then people should be involved in those changes. And if we think it's acceptable for Gordon, as well-meaning as he is, and the commissioner to go into a dark room, come back with a report, and then maybe talk to a handful of people in local government, possibly a few others, and that's a consultation, I'm afraid it isn't. There needs to be a proper conversation, people empowered into how we go forward on this. Otherwise, it won't get in. But I don't think this will last more than 10 years of this current form, because I don't think it talks about the voting system. That's integral to giving one political party control. It doesn't discuss the real issue of sovereignty and how that's pushed out away from the feudal, archaic system of crown sovereignty, which basically gives sovereignty to one person, the prime minister. Yeah, we need to move away from it. We need to push sovereignty. And thirdly, we need to talk about the union, politics, about how that stays how that changes or stays as it is. Because until we do that, then the union is, I think, likely to kind of come up. And I actually want to see it stay together, but it's how we're going to share that with the other countries in the union. And that doesn't happen at the moment. And then we can start, I think, talking about England and what happens at a local level. So for me, the report is a great first step. But there's still a lot that hasn't been answered. There's still a lot of questions about how this can be. But I think the final point is a written constitution, because I think without a written constitution, we are forever, I feel, going around in circles about what rights people have. Now, this gets around it by having these laws, which the second chamber will then uphold. But again, once you have the same sovereignty situation and the same first past post voting system, I think it'll be very easy for a future conservative to come in and sweep away so many of the changes that have been made. This has to be better for people. We have to entrench that power with local communities, with other sovereign nations.
Great. Thank you very much, Clive. So we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much to everyone, all our speakers, to Matt, Justin, to Clive, to Uzma, to John, of course. Just to say, just before we leave, our main campaign within the Labour network is manifesting for England. In the same way that the Labour Party publishes Scottish, Welsh manifestos, we also want to do this, get Labour to do this in England as well. England-specific issues, whether it's water, the NHS, education, things like that. All of those kind of essential kind of Labour issues, Labour wins on and Labour does it. So essentially, if you can, I'll leave the leaflets out here. I'll put a few on the chairs beforehand. They'll be out here. Please feel free to take one and just kind of try and support that as well. John's got some events with the Centre for English Identity coming up, and that will be on your email. So thank you very much for coming, and we've got 5 minutes.
Awesome.